What is up, everybody? Jim to my right, our good friend, Mr. Ryan Muckenhirn across from us. Both of you guys are trying to laugh. A little bit immature. I think I know why you're laughing. Because it's time for anatomy class. Which would be maybe possibly a little bit uncomfortable, but we're talking about the anatomy of a real mature guys. The anatomy of a cartridge. And I would think, okay, a lot of our listeners are very familiar with the components that go into a cartridge, right? Is my fly down?
No, I just Mark.
I'm fine. That was a great intro.
Oh, thank you.
I'm finally over
It
it.
was really good.
Ryan's the last one to
I'm sorry.
get it together here.
It's fine.
No,
Usually you're so composed.
You're so good at, like Jim said, intros.
That's a very big compliment.
Beyond reproach.
Wow. Word of the day.
I'll look it up later.
We keep a gun of the day calendar downstairs. That's the word of the day.
What's the gun of the day today?
I haven't looked at it today.
Oh, what was it yesterday?
I believe it was a Remington 700 of some kind, but I have to look. I have to look at it. Kim keeps the calendar up.
That's like the car of the day being a Toyota Camry.
He takes that job very seriously.
He's pretty wild about it.
So this was many days ago, but I was down there and he wrote down the gun of the day. What was that? Was that a Remington autoloader in 280? Isn't that what that was?
No, it was a carbine, in 30-06. Equally rare gun. Not equally rare, also rare.
It was something in a 280. It was just a couple weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
10-ish minutes. We got to get back to cartridges.
Okay.
Which are fired from rifles.
I tried.
And also other firearms, too.
Getting back to the anatomy of a cartridge, what I was starting to say was probably pretty basic for a lot of our listeners or even a lot of folks out there, right? However, I was this was a little bit ago. It was like some news outlet, I'm sure very reputable, where they were talking about. I don't recall the exact gist of the story, but shots fired, coming dangerously close. I'm kind of making it up, but I think it was something like that. And they had a picture. They had a picture to go along with the article, and it was the entire cartridge like sticking out of the wall, like it was partially into the wall, but it was. If you're watching on YouTube, I mean, it was the full thing that apparently, according to this very reputable news outlet, had flown, had entered the wall like.
So somebody was like just throwing
factor.
darts, but with a whole cartridge.
So somebody, they placed it in the hole. So I said, well, maybe this information would be good for, maybe it would help. Maybe it would help them out a little bit. I guess.
Maybe it would.
We don't want to do that though. You don't want to help the enemy.
I do have, as we go through this, I do have some very important points I'd like to bring up because I have some family members who have fairly recently gotten into firearms, and I did have a family member who, I'll give one example of something that can happen quite frequently to new gun owners. He went out and he wanted to buy some bullets for his new handgun. And so he went online. He thought, holy smokes, look at this deal. These guys are selling bullets way less expensive than everybody else. And he bought them. And when they showed up, he said, what is this, the Civil War? I have to load my own bullets now?
He just bought some bullets.
He just bought some bullets. He didn't actually buy finished fireable cartridges.
Yeah, I feel like we, in general, talk about that, I guess, with correct terminology, right? Bullets versus cartridge. But a lot of folks, man, I need to get some bullets. You know? And so, like, I can see where he's like, yeah, I need to order some bullets.
Yeah.
He got bullets.
Right. Oh, yeah, he got bullets. He just doesn't have the rest of the stuff.
Right. To make
the
cartridge. Ryan, we got a bunch of stuff on the table here. Really all the components. You've got them nicely placed out on the front, and then we kind of have them in their, I guess, bulk form, if you will, on the other side. What's going on? What's going on with the cartridge? What makes an entire cartridge tick?
We should make some distinctions here.
Oh, okay.
This is a metallic cartridge.
Okay, fair enough.
Not a paper cartridge, which that's still a thing, or shot shell. Mm-hmm. This happens to be a bottlenecked rifle cartridge.
Okay.
As opposed to a straight wall.
What?
That is important to distinctify.
What cartridge is that you have out there as an example?
This is a 6.5 BC.
We should start working on that again.
It's on the calendar.
I put it on your calendar today.
I was delighted to know this.
We're going to have some fun.
Yeah. So this is a 6.5 BC cartridge, one of several of the BC family. And we've got the whole smattering of goods here in the broken down form and then in the completed form. So as you're looking, I think this would display on your screen right to left.
Mm-hmm.
On the furthest right side here, this small, tiny little component that I'm pointing to here is the primer. Primers come in a variety of sizes for metallic rifle or pistol cartridges. This one happens to be a large rifle magnum primer. The primer is the component in the cartridge on the back end of it. This is called the case head itself. Inset this little pocket here. I've got an example of an unprimed case next to this primed case. We have the primer pocket. Primer resides in there, and that's the first thing that starts the chain of explosion that allows us to fire our cartridge in our gun.
What's the deal with a primer? Prior to primers like this, what was being accomplished in order to make the bullet exit the barrel? Like what has this gotten us? This is been around for a long time, but we'll call it modern.
Yep. So prior to the primer being contained in the case, the primer was an exterior component. I'm not saying that right. It was
external.
External. That's the word I'm looking for. It was an external component. So what Jim's getting to is like muzzle loading firearms. So we'll go back in time and I'll just pick like a Hawken rifle. So you had your powder, your primer, and your bullet all separated. You'd mix them together in the gun, and then you'd have a firing solution. The primer at that point in time, it was still called a primer, or a percussion cap would be another way you could look at it. Or it would go on a specific part called a nipple on the gun, and then an external hammer would strike it, light it, or ignite it, which would then follow through a little channel in the side of the gun into the powder column that was in the barrel, would ignite that and push the bullet out the barrel.
Sure enough.
So when we got into metallic cartridges, we contained the primer with the thing. There was a transitionary period there in which there was a paper cartridge externally primed, and then it went to a lot of rimfire cartridges and then pinfire cartridges and then center fires as we know them now. So primer, a little metallic cup. Within it resides a highly volatile, explosive that is ignited via speed and pressure of the firing pin or hammer striking it. There's another component at the top of it, and this might be a little bit hard to picture. It's called the anvil. That makes sure that we have proper distribution of flame, as well as thing that'll keep us from crushing our primer, as well as a means to allow the ignition to actually happen. So we have a strike in the back, and then that pressure there. Neat little component.
A lot going on in that.
There is.
A
primer's a pretty complex little mechanism.
And they're so tiny.
They are, yeah. And that's the big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, not the big one. There's still like a 50 BMG primer. That's pretty big. Bigger yet. But that's the primer. That ignites then the next thing in the line here as we move left across your screen, the propellant. This is a particular type of propellant. It's just an extruded propellant. If you look at it, it looks like if you took a spaghetti noodle and you chopped it into like 1,000 little pieces. Some people call it a stick powder. Stick powder comes in a lot of different shapes and forms and types and burn rates and things like this. This is a pretty common propellant for this kind or class of case. It's a smokeless propellant, so that's different than black powder. So black powder is a whole different animal altogether. This propellant burns slower, burns hotter, makes more pressure to push our bullet. I actually have these backwards here. I'm going to switch that. I'm going to go like that right there.
Yep,
Okay.
I like that.
Yeah, that's better.
Can we talk about propellants for like a hot sec?
Well, yeah.
Because when you're going out and buying just factory loaded ammunition, which I used to do before I was a big reloader. You'll have to go back and watch our reloading pod adventure from many moons ago to see when Mark and I became big time reloaders. But I just always used to buy. It was like, I just trust that. I just thought powder was powder. You go and you buy ammo and it's got powder in it. It's gonna go bang when you light it off. Well, then you start talking to people who reload and they're like, oh well. Here we have H48831 shortcut SC. This is Hodgdon or Hodgdon or something. Is that how you say Hodgdon? Hodgdon. You've got Reloader XYZ. You've got all these different powders, Some of them are more volatile than others. Some of them are more temperature stable than others. There's all these different types. And I've always wondered, like, why?
Well, they need to accomplish a different task, perhaps. So let's think about
need a specific powder podcast.
Let's think about octane. We're going to bring it back to cars, Jim. You've been gone a
thanks.
while. Why would one use 100+ octane fuel?
High compression.
High compression. Right. Excellent. Why would one use Why would one use an 85 octane fuel?
Cheap.
Okay. Well, that's not okay. So like propellant is going to do a very specific thing, and there's a couple of things that, like as a reloader, which isn't really what this podcast is about, but you want to match your propellant, like the burn rate or the technology in it, with things like the case volume, the bullet diameter, the bullet weight, and desired results. If you're seeking velocity, there's going to be a powder that's known to generate velocity. If you're seeking temperature stability, there's a powder that's going to be known for doing that kind of thing. And then there's like definitely an appropriate match for the cartridge as a whole, right? Where it gets really tricky is to your point, there's hundreds of different propellants, and like understanding what one does and where it should go and where it shouldn't go is a little bit more advanced. The good news is you can get powder burn rate tables, and you can look at them. You can see the name of that powder, the manufacturer of that powder, and its burn rate relative to others on the market. Also, on those powder canisters, they're going to list acceptable cases to put them in. And then Hodgdon has a phenomenal load data center on their website. You can look at this. It's very important that the wrong propellant not be put in the wrong case.
Right.
Just cataclysm can ensue. So, for instance, if you load a 338 Lapua with an equivalent amount of a pistol powder called H110, you have created a bomb. If you load it with H1000, you have a very controlled and safe thing, as long as you're hitting that load requirement correctly.
Now, usually, just to kind of go back to the factory ammo side of things, usually they're using some sort, whatever powder they use in the bullet certainly isn't going to be a bomb for you if they're a reputable manufacturer. And then it's probably going to be kind of good at most things.
Yeah, correct.
Like it may not be the best at one certain thing that you may be looking for, but that's maybe a reason to get into reloading eventually, and that's another topic.
Yes. So then we move on to the cartridge case itself. We can call this brass, call it a case, call it a casing. I've heard people refer to them as shells. It could be a lot of different things. All this is a kind of a vessel and a vehicle to contain everything, to help build pressure, to make sure that it's a safe, functional, and reliable operation that's going on, right? So these are typically made out of brass. They're also made out of steel, and as of the past decade or so, we're seeing some polymers sneak into the marketplace as well.
Some aluminum ones.
Yeah, okay. Aluminum case like CCI Blazer. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Typically a metal product, very rarely and occasionally a polymer product. Very strong structure. And again, it's designed to contain everything into a single, thing that we're going to load, fire, and shoot. It's very portable, really neat.
Can you quickly name going bottom to top?
Bottom to top.
I was just going to...
Thank you.
The parts of the case. It's not just all necessary. You can break it down even further.
This is what happens when you know a lot about a thing. You glaze over the stuff that maybe people don't know. So starting on the case head here, usually you're going to see information about that cartridge, the manufacturer, the brass, etc., embossed onto the case head itself. And then we have our primer pocket, which we covered. If we then flip the case, we're going to start going from bottom to top. This is typically called the rim itself. Rims come in a lot of different forms and shapes and designs. This is technically a rimless case, even though there's a rim there. It doesn't stick out like a 30-30 Winchester would, or a 357 or a 44 Magnum or something like that. That's a rimmed case. And then forward of that is what's called the extractor groove. So I like that they threw groove in there because we all know that's a groove. That part there, what happens here, your rifle will have an extractor that hooks on the back side of the case, and that facilitates the pulling of the case out of the chamber, either to unload the firearm or when the case is fired, strip it out and put a new one in there. Forward of that, we have what's called the web, which if we had a cross-section of the case, it would, I think, better illustrate the web itself. But heavy partition of metal in this case brass, that separates the case head from the internal powder like volume within the case itself. Really, really strong piece of that brass.
It seems like a lot of the stress of the firing event is placed on the web.
Web takes a lot of brunt. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. I should also back up. Through the web goes the flash hole, which is that tiny little hole. If you can see that on the screen there, it's called the flash hole. And that's where the gases from the primer's ignition are vented into the powder volume and capacity of the case there. And that's what actually burns the powder up via the flash hole. So we would then call everything forward of the web, but under the shoulder, the case body. And again, if we were looking at a cross-section, we would then call it the case wall on one side. It's body when it's three-dimensional, wall when it's one. And that would go up the length of the case to the body-shoulder junction, which is where this angle terminates, and then we go on into the case body or case wall again, which leads us to the shoulder. In a cartridge like the 6.5 BC, the shoulder does a couple of things. It helps us build pressure. It provides us with reliable and repeatable means of proper headspace when we chamber that cartridge inside of that gun. And this design here, a bottlenecked rifle cartridge, sans belt, sans rim, is pretty modern when we're looking at what you'll find in like a 6.5 Creedmoor, a 308 Winchester, a 30-06, a 270, etc. From the shoulder, then we go to the shoulder neck junction, which is just where the case neck, which is this slightly elongated piece or cylinder is that hooks up to the shoulder, and then the neck itself. Next job is to hold the bullet in place, center it up with the bore, provide adequate tension or squeeze on the projectile itself while it's in its loaded state, which in turn helps build pressure consistently. And and then if we flip the case over so that you can see into the hole here, this is simply called the case mouth. This is where our bullet enters, our bullet exits, our exhaust gases leave the case.
Perfect.
And there's a lot of anatomy in just case.
Oh, the fact of the matter is you have calibers, which would be like 30 caliber, which there are many cartridges within, let's say, 30 caliber, many cartridges. And this is something that was also, I know, confusing to me at first. It was like, 30-06 and a 308, two different cartridges that can shoot the same bullets.
Yep.
Because they are both 30 caliber cartridges.
Correct.
And so that's where somebody went in and essentially designed different cases to achieve different results out of the bullet and the rifle, but you're still shooting the same bullets.
Yep.
Which was like super wild to me. One day that finally just clicked, and I was like, oh, wait a minute. There's more of a limited selection, if you will, of bullet diameters than there are of cases.
Yes.
There's like infinitely many types of cases and
Yes.
shapes and sizes and all that. But you only have a limited amount of bullet diameters.
Yeah, so the bullet is your thing that you're moving. The case is just the vessel that contains the means to propel that bullet.
Yeah, and it can absolutely have a big impact on how the bullet performs.
Yeah. So moving away from the case,
Ryan,
Mark,
can
go
I
ahead. Yeah.
hit pause here? I can't tell, but I do think we might have a 300 Win Mag, which would have a belt on it behind
It does.
you.
Good call, Mark.
So just to point out, like when people talk about a belted Magnum.
Yeah.
Sounds cool.
So forward of the extractor groove and just on the web is this belt, which is a vestigial trait left over from kind of an era bygone in which a lot of cases had belts to add strength and control headspace. These days, modern cases headspace off of the shoulder. Typically, there's some concessions there, but that belt is kind of a leftover from era bygone. And there, I think, was a whole class of cartridges that were distinguished as more powerful or more capable because, well, it was a belted Magnum.
Growing up, I didn't even know what belted mean. I was like, oh, that's more.
It's got a belt, it'll take them down.
Yeah.
It'll really belt it out there. So that is a case belt. So common cartridges that would have that, like 7 Rem Mag, 300 Win Mag, 338 Win Mag.
7 Rem Mag, you love that one.
Yeah, that's moving on to the bullet or the projectile itself. These come in a lot of different shapes, weights, sizes, flavors, styles. This is a really cool tool when we're looking at the breakdown of the cartridge itself. This is a lot of times what makes or breaks your firing solution, the adeptness of your projectile or its design cues to do a very certain thing. So in this case, this is a .264 diameter or 6.5 millimeter diameter projectile. That's an interchangeable figure there. And it is aptly paired with the 6.5 BC cartridge that we have here. This particular one is what is known as a boat-tailed rifle cartridge. You'll notice on the what would be proximal end, if we're holding it from the base forward.
The butt end.
Yeah, the butt end. There's like a little rebate that goes on there where we have this the shank of this bullet, and then all of a sudden it takes a little angle in towards the heel and the base of the bullet, and that's called a boat tail. And that does a couple of things for us as shooters. If you're a hand loader, it helps you align and guide that projectile into the case mouth. And then in flight, that provides a little bit more of an aerodynamic solution than just, say, a flat base bullet that would otherwise not have that little taper on the back. This particular bullet has some driving bands in it, or these relief grooves that'll allow, shouldn't really call them a driving band because they're not in this case, but a relief groove.
Can we call them belts?
We could call them belts.
Just kidding. Don't call
Okay.
It's not a belt.
No, that's not a belt. It just sounds provocative.
That'll allow material from the shank of the bullet that's being contacted by the lands and grooves of the rifling to actually flow into and deposit as opposed to depositing on your bore.
Whoa.
In this case, it's a all copper projectile.
Correct. Yep.
You got stuff coming off of your bullet in the barrel?
Absolutely. Yep.
Is that because of the obturation?
Bingo.
Shout out, Luke.
Oh, Jim. Second word of the day, obturation.
No, you
said
one.
vestigious.
That's what I was. Yeah, that was a good one.
What?
Oh,
vestigial.
You don't even know when it comes out of your mouth. That's how
Vestigial.
haughty and smart you are.
Yeah, so what Jim's talking about there is when we ignite that powder, and that powder goes from its solid state to a gaseous form, and it begins pushing the projectile forward, the back of the bullet, and mostly the back of the bullet, is going to swell slightly. The term is obturate. Fill the bore, seal the bore, and allow, as it's going down the barrel, to properly engage lands and grooves of rifling or the twisty stuff in the barrel itself. Provide proper spin, prevent gas from slipping around or forward of the bullet. And that's kind of a lot of the secret sauce of projectile making is making sure that the projectile does that properly. In this case, because this particular bullet is solid in design, there's no soft, malleable lead core. It's very hard, right? And so to make sure that the material that is being moved or engraved from the lands and grooves of rifling doesn't just end up depositing on your bore, and instead of you having a 6.5, you have a 6.4, it flows into those grooves there and prevents excessive fouling from occurring. So very neat little feature. And a lot of bullets will have that are of this design. Forward of that would be what we call our ogive, or I will often refer to it as just the nose of the bullet. So we're going to go from a diameter of X, in this case 0.264 inches, to the ogive, which will have a radius taper to it that would then terminate up towards the nose of the bullet. If this is a hollow point, I'd call it a meplat.
Oh.
Yeah. Or meplat. I don't actually know what the proper pronunciation is.
I've always heard meplat.
Yeah.
Oh. Good to know.
And so the nose of the bullet, or the leading edge of the bullet that's cutting air, you'll see a lot of discussion over what the best nose cone shape is, or best meplat shape. Is it a hollow point? Is it a modern, polymer tip on the front there? Is it lead? They come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and configurations and constructions. In this case, it happens to have a polymer tip. And that's a bullet.
We should do a podcast also about bullet tips sometime.
We should.
I learned some very interesting things about hollow points, and they're not like a giant sail in the wind, and they actually have like an invisible point once they start flying through the air.
Yep. And then the inside of a bullet in itself has all kinds of different anatomy, or could.
Oh my gosh!
In this case, if you cut this one open, it's just copper. But certain bullets have structures on the inside of them, partitions on the inside of them, little features on the inside of them that allow the bullet to do or accomplish a certain thing in an appropriate way.
Sometimes it's just flying through the air real nice, and ultimately it has to hit a steel target, which you don't really care about necessarily being ethical about the way in which you hit a steel target. Sometimes it has to do with flying through the air pretty well, but then ultimately having devastating effect on the game animal or whatever it is that you're hunting, and hopefully game animals for the most part. Anyway, but and then doing what it needs to do quickly.
Yeah, I mean, a Bullets podcast is 100% a podcast.
I'm going to need a little
in and
saw.
of itself.
It's like a little saw to cut them in half.
You need a saw. Oh yeah,
Should
we
get
do.
one of
We should
those.
get one of those. There is a milling machine that I think I've even been able to overhear on the other side of that wall a little bit, so we could maybe.
And then, when you take all those things and you put them together, either if you do it yourself or you go buy it new, you end up with a cartridge.
Yes, or a round, or what are other
Cartridge, round, a bullet. Although a bullet
it's
is
not
only
a
one. I know, but
misnomer.
it's like saying
common
horns.
Now that you've heard this
vernacular,
podcast,
common
you
vernacular.
can go out and say, "Oh, I've got this many bullets," but you at least have now that you're
Yeah.
what you're referring to, and that
It's like calling horns or antlers horns.
Yeah, I agree. I do that.
Yeah,
Instead
it
of
is
horns
a
on
little bit. It is a little bit.
Yeah.
That's
You always know what somebody means.
Put it all together, and that's what you get. You get a cartridge.
I like it.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Ryan.
Wow, it's my pleasure, truly.
And that one little brick from Federal there might as well be a brick of gold, huh, Ryan? It is a
Easy,
gold
yeah,
brick.
honestly,
It's
we
a
shouldn't
gold
go.
brick.
We shouldn't go showing the world of reloaders
This
that
is
we have
empty.
this on hand.
Completely empty.
There.
In fact, our packaging engineers just threw this together out of some. It's a Kleenex box wrapped in.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's no primers in that box.
Can I ask one thing real fast?
Please.
We're so far over time, it doesn't even matter at this point. But anyway, primers don't exist in rimfire cartridges. What's my 22 LR got going on back there to make it go bang?
That's an awesome question. So, the case itself is the primer.
Yeah, that's kind of bizarre.
It is.
You stuff a bullet in a primer in.
Yeah.
It's a powder as well.
So, if you could think about that chemical compound within the metallic primer that we have here on the table, a similar compound is simply inserted into the 22 LR case. And through a variety of mechanisms, it's either just dropped in there, like in a goop. So think like you have a tiny little pipette, and you put a little goop in there, or they put it in and using a centrifuge, they spin it to the inside of the rim. So here again, if you were to cross-section the case, you'd have the case wall, and then that leads out to the rim. There's like a little gap in there, and that centrifuge will pull that priming compound into that rim. And then when you strike the case with the firing pin of your rifle, it ignites much the same way. There's a very specific propellant that's used in 22 long rifle. On the scale, it's extremely fast. And then that, of course, pushes the bullet down the board just as the same centerfire cartridge would. But that priming compound is contained in the case itself as opposed to a separate primer. So even a shotgun shell would use a separate primer. It actually uses a primer inside of a sleeve that goes inside of the case head, which is really fascinating, unless you're using metallic shotgun cases, which do exist.
Oh.
Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah,
Thank you for that clarification.
in fact.
Ryan, thank you for all the clarification.
Yeah,
A lot going on with a cartridge.
a lot.
Now you know, though.
It's quite...
We did come up with a number of other podcasts that we need to do, just walking through these.
Yep.
100%. So awesome. Well, I know I always learn something. Hopefully you all out there learn something. If you didn't know what makes up a cartridge, what possibly some people, or what often gets referred to as a bullet, or you've perhaps seen a news article with an entire cartridge sticking out of something, well, I think our listeners are pretty familiar with all this stuff, so I don't think they'd be necessarily fooled by that. But
Share this with some of your friends who would be fooled.
Yes, there you go. There you go. So awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Until next time, happy hunting and shooting. We'll catch you on the next one.
Clock just said 1911.
See ya.
Bam.
Good way to end. Bye.